is better to trust in the Lord than to trust in mankind. Alleluia. For his mercy endureth forever and ever. Alleluia. It is better to hope in the Lord than
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Road to Paradise. My name is Ian Silver, and I'm here with my co-host, Nathaniel Harmon. And today's episode, we are going to be discussing Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Harvard address, talking a little bit about his life, and addressing, some more issues of what's wrong with the world, continuing our series. If you guys have listened to the last episode, we appreciate that. Make sure to give this a big like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and family.
And also make a comment if you feel like doing so. We'd be curious to hear your feedback.
Yeah, the comments are very appreciated. They help with the YouTube, and they help with all the algorithms and kind of get us ahead a little bit. So we appreciate that. And with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. I believe Nathan is going to start with a quote by Solzhenitsyn. So Nathan, go ahead.
So this is a quote from the end of a letter called Live Not by Lies, which was published after his arrest in 1974, right before his exile from the Soviet Union to the West. And it proceeds thusly: "But if we shrink away, then let us cease complaining that someone does not let us draw breath. We do it to ourselves. Let us then cower and hunker down, while our comrades the biologists spring closer the day when our thoughts can be read and our genes altered. And if from this we also shrink away, then we are worthless, hopeless. And it is of us that Pushkin asks with scorn, why offer herds their liberation, their heritage each generation, the yoke with jingles and the whip." So that is a wonderful quote to the extent that such negative sentiments can be wonderful. But Ian, can you tell us a little bit about who Alexander Solzhenitsyn was?
Yeah, definitely. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Russian novelist, a well-known philosopher, historian, and short story writer, and a political prisoner in the Gulag system, and one of the most famous Soviet dissidents of his time, of all time. Solzhenitsyn was an outspoken critic of communism and helped to raise global awareness of political repression within the Soviet Union, and in particular in the Gulag system. So that's just a brief description of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but There was also a lot of other aspects of his life that were interesting, and maybe Nathan can tell you just a little bit more about that.
This again will be terribly brief, but Solzhenitsyn was a member of one of the families in Russia that, after the godless Bolsheviks came to power, stayed faithful to the Orthodox Church. He recounted in either one of his letters or one of his essays, I don't remember which one, that one of his earliest memories is his mother holding him above the crowds of people in the church that they attended so that he could see the procession of the mysteries of the Eucharist. And this was when he was obviously a very small child. But despite having such a firm foundation, he ended up falling into atheism and Marxist ideology, as happens to young people who are maybe somewhat disillusioned with their circumstances. But that really aggressively changed in World War II. He was an infantry officer. I believe he served in an artillery unit.
I think he was a captain in the Red Army, right?
Right. And he was critical of Joseph Stalin in a letter that he sent to a friend of his, and because
private letter
private letters aren't private, in totalitarian regimes, nothing is private. That was discovered, and this was, as we know, not a good thing because Stalin was a paranoid sociopath. So any kind of criticism is what amounts to a sin against the state. And so Solzhenitsyn was sent to the Gulags for, I believe it was 8 or 10 years, I don't remember off the top of my head, but as a result of that, he returned to his faith and became a very philosophically active critic of all things materialist and humanist and anti-Christian. And that brings us to...
Yeah, he was exiled, and I heard there was one quote that I read that said that he was almost too famous to be killed.
Well, that was after the Gulags. So he composed the Gulags kind of in his head, actually, while he was being shipped around to this system of prison camps in Siberia. And after the fact, when he got out, he was one of the fortunate ones, obviously, who survived. But when he got out, he had various things typed up, various manuscripts typed up, and eventually when it was published, it became so popular in the Western world that not even a government like the Soviet Union could get away with killing him, because he was one of the few non-political entities that was known, and he was too famous of a dissident to do anything to.
So he had 2 copies of the manuscript written. One copy was found at one point by the KGB, and apparently the typist who had it actually ended up committing suicide, is what I read.
Huh. It seems that we have similarities across time and space for dissidents having interesting fates.
So yeah, as you were saying, he had it written down in various places because being caught with a pen and paper or writing about these things while you're in the Gulag system is probably not...
Well, in the Gulag, you could come across things like that. If you've never read Solzhenitsyn, a good place to start, I think, if you're not going to read his speeches or his letters or his essays, is a book called The Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
Yeah, we'll make sure to link that in the description and whatnot.
It's only, I don't know, I'd say it's 55, 60 pages.
Around there. Maybe a little longer, I think, but yeah, basically.
It's good prose, and that kind of shows you what a good day in the Gulag looked like. And the disconcerting part of that is you get to the end of the day and you haven't died.
Yeah.
Which is a really, really, I don't want to poke too much fun at Russians, but that's one of the most Russian things that I think anyone can say.
And even some of the prisoners would become like officers at some point.
Right.
I read, and they would be more brutal than prior,
Well, one of the things that you see in the in the first volume of the Gulag Archipelago, which, if you're feeling lucky, definitely start with that, but it is a hefty read, and it is not something that you read because you're having a good day.
It's almost, 2,000 pages, like 1,500 or so?
Oh, no, it's almost 1,900 or 2,000 pages. But one of the things that's noted there is that the legitimate criminals were treated better in the gulags than the political prisoners, which isn't a shock when you think about it for a moment, because the prisoners, the thieves and the robbers, and the murderers and whatever else, they can be reformed because they've not committed crimes against the revolution. But a political prisoner has, and there's really, that's kind of the unpardonable sin in the revolution. So yeah, those prisoners of the Gulag system who took the side of the Soviets definitely were far more savage and became far less human in many ways.
Yeah. So after his time in the Gulag, he then was exiled, correct?
Yes.
What year was that in? I believe it was
1974.
And where was he exiled to?
He was exiled to the West, generally speaking, but he eventually made his home in New York.
He went to Switzerland for a few years too, correct?
Yeah. Switzerland ended up with a lot of Russian expats. There's one slightly lesser known Russian dissident who reposed in 1952, I believe, is when Ivan Ilyin reposed. But he ended up in Switzerland and France for a while as well, when he finally got kicked out of Russia by Lenin. But he was another one of these people who was, at the time, a bit too famous to be killed in the revolution.
So after his expulsion from the Soviet Union, he ends up in the West. And what happens after that? He becomes kind of famous in the West for his writings.
He does. He's actually, and this is something that is not as well known to anyone. We'll link this podcast episode as well. But there, in 2008, which is when Solzhenitsyn reposed, Father Thomas Hopko did a brief reflection on his life. And one of the things that will point out, is that Solzhenitsyn and Father Alexander Solzhenitsyn were actually acquaintances. They had some disagreements on various things that didn't necessarily get resolved in the best way, but yeah, they were friends and did work together, if my memory is correct. But yeah, he ended up in New York and
Connecticut too, right?
No, maybe it was Connecticut.
Yeah.
I stand corrected. But he,
in a small town which he ended up loving and speaking about,
right,
with a lot of high regard.
He was fond of it, but he did return to Russia, which is where he reposed after the fall of the Soviet Union, which the first time I heard that, I remember thinking it was very strange that a man would want to do that. But then I realized that Solzhenitsyn actually had had patriotism ordered appropriately in his life.
Yeah, his form of nationalism wasn't toxic.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even
call it.
I wouldn't even say that particular impulse was nationalistic. There might have been that might have been an impulse for sure, but he was in many ways the architect of the destruction of the Soviet Union. The Gulag Archipelago showed the lie to what the Soviets said they were doing and what they said their project was. And it was such a masterfully written and well-timed piece of work. We can obviously see God's providence there, but it was so well-timed that not even the members of the American media and the intelligentsia, who were so fond of the communist experiments that were going on in Europe at the time, could stand against him. So, kind of a funny aside, I was trying to find some PDFs of some of Solzhenitsyn's speeches the other day, because I've got some of his works, but I'm too lazy to order stuff off of Amazon, and also kind of not amenable to that idea anymore.
We'll get into that soon.
But the bookstores in Flagstaff don't have tons of Solzhenitsyn stuff, and as a result of Ian getting into this, I've got competition. So I was Googling to try to find these PDFs, and I typed in something Gulag Archipelago, and one of the autocomplete options that came up was how to debunk Solzhenitsyn, and I was like, or no, how to debunk the Gulag Archipelago, and I was like, how
do you debunk that?
He's definitely making philosophical and religious arguments in that, but
it's
his recollection and his autobiography of what occurred in the Gulags.
Yeah.
That's not something that you can rebut.
It's not a myth.
Well, people will say that, and that we might talk about my acquaintance who made particular comments about Stalin later, but yeah, people are rather interesting.
So, and we'll end up talking about, like the misconceptions of his speech and what the press and media thought of him. But in 1978, he made a Harvard commencement speech titled "A World Split Apart," correct?
Yes.
And that's what we're going to be diving into today. So what would you say, really, what came of that, and how did the media and the press take it? At first, they when he shows up, everybody's clapping and they love him, and it's everybody assumes it's going to be him praising America for its
Well, that is what everyone expected, because after all, Solzhenitsyn was what we would now classify as a victim of a totalitarian regime.
Yeah.
And so one would think, coming to a country that was allowing him asylum, he would have nothing but high praise for that country, which is what the press and what everyone at Harvard was expecting him to say.
And it's not as if he was speaking as a friend, not an adversary, but that point was missed by most, and was considered at times to be anti-American.
Well, the tone of his speech and the reaction to his speech were precursors to what we're now seeing happen in America. And that is this idea that if you are someone's friend, you may only speak positively of them. So Solzhenitsyn's speech is very, very critical of the United States. And it is critical of capitalism and various other aspects of American culture, such as specifically the materialistic acquisitiveness of capitalism, but also the lust for information in the media, the unjustified power that the media holds in our country, the cowardice of our population, the ignorance of our elites. And what he points to is the root of this is our spiritual bankruptcy and our cowardice and our lack of courage. But what's interesting about the reaction is the audio is available on YouTube, so you can listen to the speech that he's giving through a translator. And
yeah, it's a little hard to listen to at first.
Right, but if you've never read or listened to the speech, definitely listen to it, but then go back and listen to it again at a later point when you're not wanting to refresh yourself on what Solzhenitsyn said, and listen to the background noise. Because one of the interesting things that you'll note is you can hear people boo if you pay attention.
Yeah.
You can hear people boo, you can hear people throwing things, and according to people,
the liberal Democrats.
Well, not even the liberal Democrats, just people who disagreed. A lot of the students got very upset. And if you find interviews with people who were there, I can't remember who the professor was that was there, but he gives kind of a commentary on what the crowd was like.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can find that video and send it to Ian, because that's an interesting thing in and of itself. But people are throwing chairs and throwing things at the stage because they're so upset, because they view his criticism.
He did not seem fazed by it at all.
Well, to a man who lived in the Gulag and in Russia, somebody throwing a Coke bottle at you is a pretty mundane thing.
Picks it up, takes a drink,
Yeah, I mean, well.
So yeah, they and also he was called many names after his speech, and some of them were a fanatic, an Orthodox mystic, which previous to us going live on the stream, we both had a good laugh about that, because it's
like, that's not an insult.
Yeah. So an Orthodox mystic, a fierce dogmatic,
also not an insult.
A political romantic.
I wouldn't call that an insult either.
A conservative radical. And that people said that it was a reactionary speech, and that somehow he had lost his balance, and it was as if someone was speaking with a mind split apart, which was them trying to use, the title of his speech against him. So it wasn't as well received as, it was well received, but it wasn't what people expected.
Well, certainly not. And it is, and this will perhaps be another podcast at a later date, but one of the things that he is extraordinarily critical of is the Enlightenment project, although I would venture to say that he was not critical enough. But regardless, he, in that sense, some of these name-calling, exercises in name-calling are accurate. He is definitely a conservative radical in some regards, and he's definitely giving a reactionary speech. But I mean, if we're going to be honest, the vast majority of dialogue is reactionary.
Yeah.
Because if there was not something to push back against, Solzhenitsyn never would have had to stand up and give that speech.
He wouldn't have to react.
I mean, the Gulag Archipelago is a reactionary text to a movement that was reactionary against another, we'll say more materialistic kind of repression.
Yeah.
Like, you don't do things that aren't reactionary, generally speaking.
No.
Especially not in this milieu. But
Yeah, he mentions in the Harvard speech, he sheds light on the source of our ailments, and that secular humanism that came out of the Enlightenment. And I guess one of the first things that we're going to get into is how the West is spiritually sick.
Ian, what is your prognosis? Via Solzhenitsyn, of course.
On how the West is spiritually sick. Well, I would say one of the things is that the West has lost its connection with an older moral capital, a classical and Christian civilization.
Okay, what do you mean by moral capital?
Well, I guess I would just say that it seems everybody is only focused on what matters to them.
Okay, so an unhealthy manner of self-obsession.
Yeah, hyper-individualism, which we'll get into as well. But
excellent.
Yeah, I know you love that. And just, that we have a problem blaming. It seems that we like to blame things on others and on society without looking internally, which is something in the Orthodox faith that we're taught to do. Is it starts with you.
We're supposed to do that anyway.
Yeah.
I know more often than not that road is littered with failures.
Yes.
But
So people blaming society versus self-reflection, is something he touches on as well, and which is a result of losing our connection with God.
okay. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is, as we've already kind of begun to discuss, is why is the West spiritually sick? So I'm going to ask you, Ian, why is it that the unhealthy self-obsession we have is a symptom of cowardice, which is what Solzhenitsyn says is one of the great moral failings of the West? I'm sorry for surprising you.
No. I like that. So a decline in courage.
Yeah. Why is the kind of self-obsession we have a symptom of a lack of courage?
Well, I think that we live in a civilization that's based on the pursuit of happiness.
Okay.
And that would undermine a spiritual and moral strength of Western tradition.
Okay. How?
I mean, what would you say?
He's getting clever. He's trying to make me shoot myself with my own gun.
You asked the question. I gave a little bit of an answer. Now I want
So, one of the things, as anyone who's listening to the show who is Orthodox, which I presume many of you are, would note, is we have what others might call an unhealthy obsession with confession, right? We are a confessional faith in the sense that we are constantly trying to repent of our sins. And the self-obsession that leads to happiness fills the void that true introspection would cause. And I'll give a brief personal example of how this works. So last year I was in Utah for a family event, and it was a very emotionally significant event, we'll put it. It was, my sister got married. So my practice for that entire trip had been to go sit outside the hotel room most nights, smoke my pipe for a few minutes, and read a little bit, because when there's all kinds of family running around and doing ridiculous things,
you need to take a moment for yourself.
You've got to take a moment to unwind.
Yeah.
And talking can do that, but I'm not always a huge fan of that, despite what others might.
You don't like hearing your own voice?
I'm not a fan of the sound of my own voice. Well, that's not true. So the night before the ceremony actually occurs, I think to myself, I ought to go sit outside and read for a little bit, because, tomorrow's going to be a really stressful day. So I go sit outside, and by the grace of God was able to engage in some legitimate reflection. And that, in many ways, because of the circumstances, it was a lot of reflection on how my relationship with my sister had been over the years, which I hadn't spent a lot of time considering, at least lately. And that was an extraordinarily uncomfortable thing to do. I would not say that was something that pursues happiness the way that we as modern Americans tend to think of it. It was
to sit there and look inside of yourself.
Yeah, to sit there and to try to make an honest examination of myself was, and as anyone who's ever done confession knows, Ian, you just did your life confession fairly recently.
Yeah.
Like, that is a virtuous and good thing to do,
It's not easy.
My goodness, it's hard.
Yes, so that's something that, yeah, I like that, and it's kind of a segue into my thought about, why are you where you are based on what you have done versus blaming others,
So is that a question or a comment?
No, I'm saying
Yeah.
that's what you're doing, and that's also part of confession.
Yeah.
Is realizing, why are you where you are, and not
Mhm.
blaming it on others. And in confession, and for anybody that's Orthodox, you don't bring up other people's names. You're not confessing for anyone else but yourself.
Well, you can, but that leads to some interesting scenarios. So I'll tell another story if I may.
Yeah, I know this story. It's a good one.
So Elder Epifanios of Athens, I believe he reposed in like 1998 or something like that. It was fairly recent. Although I still look at the 90s as being a couple of years ago. Even
He's
though
a contemporary elder, though.
Yeah, he's a modern elder. He had a woman come to him one day for confession, and she spent 45 minutes whinging and complaining about her daughter-in-law. My daughter-in-law doesn't do this. My daughter-in-law does this. She makes a mess. She doesn't respect me. Blah blah blah. Goes on and on and on for 45 minutes. And Elder Epifanios, being a wonderful man of God, sits there and listens patiently. And eventually, the woman concludes her confession. And he says, "Okay, I'll see you next Saturday." And she goes, "Well, Father, aren't you going to pray the prayers of absolution over me?" And he goes, "No, but if you bring your daughter-in-law here, I'll do them for her. You didn't confess anything."
Yeah. She blamed all her sins on her daughter.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't even say that she necessarily blamed all her sins on her daughter. I don't know the content of the confession, but she was
not confessing for her.
Yeah, she wasn't confessing for herself.
She wasn't looking inside. And
yeah.
So with that, maybe we can tie that into our next topic, which, we talked about people blaming society versus self-reflection.
Right. So
and virtue, we could speak on, virtue a little bit.
So Solzhenitsyn has let me see if I can pull the right quote up. He has a comment regarding courage that we will go to again for a moment. And he says, "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature that an outside observer notices in the West today. The Western world has lost its civic courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, in each government, in each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling and intellectual elites, causing an impression of a loss of courage by the entire society." He goes on to say some kinder things, but...
Well, let's touch on... I like that. A decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling and intellectual elites. How do we see that nowadays?
Well, first off, I'd like to set the stage a little bit more.
Perfect,
with C.S. Lewis. So I presume most of you here have read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And in that, he has a discussion on the ubiquitous nature of virtue. And one of the comments that he makes is that courage is the prime virtue, in the sense that no other virtue may be practiced without courage. Because if you believe, say, that theft is a sin, but you lack moral courage, you may well end up as a thief.
Yeah,
right?
all other...
Right. The knowledge of what is right and wrong only gets you so far if you haven't got the courage to do the thing that's right.
Yeah.
So Lewis says that courage is, and I'm going to script the paraphrase a little bit here, I think, but one of the things that he says about courage as well is there is no society that exists, and he's writing this in the 30s or 40s, the late 30s, early 40s. He says there is no society that exists that does not treat courage as a prime virtue. Even societies that are bad, right? They don't treat courage as a bad thing. However,
their definition of courage might not be the right one.
Right, but because I'm a curmudgeonly ass,
yes.
I think C.S. Lewis was wrong there, because there's something that he didn't anticipate, and that was that...
Something that Solzhenitsyn did see.
Yes, and to be fair, Solzhenitsyn had a vastly different perspective in life than Lewis did in many things. I mean, Lewis did not grow up knowing much in the way of anything about orthodoxy, if he knew anything about it at all.
He was Catholic.
Well, he wasn't
Anglican.
Catholic. Lewis was Anglican. He was he was pretty close
to... I was thinking of Tolkien for some reason.
Lewis was pretty close to Anglo-Catholic at various points, which is kind of like hyper-ritualistic Anglicanism, but which to someone who thinks that Anglicans are hyper-ritualistic is kind of hilarious, but that's beside the point. But Lewis was wrong in this regard. He did not anticipate, and this is what Solzhenitsyn saw, like Ian said, he did not anticipate that the image of courage might be emptied of what it ought to contain and filled with cowardice. And that people may still worship at the altar of courage, but
their actions.
But what that courage is no longer, or what they're calling courage is no longer courage. So
yeah, and yesterday we almost did a live video, which I think is something we should do soon about, virtue versus virtue signaling. And we don't have to go into that right now, but it kind of ties into that as well. So.
Right. So yeah, courage
being the ultimate virtue.
Courage is the ultimate virtue, and this ties in very much to Solzhenitsyn's speech, Live Not by Lies, in which he says, the place that one ought to start if one finds oneself in a place where, if you find yourself in a totalitarian regime or an authoritarian regime, and you no longer have the freedom to do the things that you ought to be able to do. So not even like, not even I've lost my freedom of speech, so I can't go put a lewd ad up on Craigslist or whatever.
Yeah.
But like, you can't go to church, like the Canadians find themselves in now.
Yeah.
With these new laws, which
we'll
discuss later.
And they did in the Bolshevik Revolution as well,
Right. When you find yourself in that position and you don't know what to do, the first place to go is not to pick up weapons and go fight, although that may be required. The first place to go is to rededicate yourself to truth.
Yeah.
So
Solzhenitsyn was calling for the non-participation of the lies of the soul.
Yes.
Which were just as devastating as the violence which sustained all those years of totalitarianism.
Well, even more devastating in some ways. So so I've mentioned Ivan Ilyin once already, and hopefully I won't go too off the rails here. But Ivan Ilyin wrote a book called On Resistance to Evil by Force. And
we have a lot of books to link.
Ilyin is a wonderful writer, but he is extremely, extremely dense. Very hard to parse sometimes. But one of the things that he says in this book, because he's writing it as a response to the Bolshevik Revolution, he's saying, okay, well, what is it that we, as those who are resisting the Bolsheviks, need to do? So, knowing that background, if you were to see the title of this book, you would think he's going to talk about why it is that God's on our side and he's not on their side, and why it's okay to go mow them down in the streets with a machine gun, right? But that's not what he's saying. He says that the Christian relationship with violence is so tightly knit that you can't really tell where one starts and the other begins. And he would say that because, in his view, violence starts on oneself. When you wake up in the morning and you need that cup of coffee. If you're a coffee addict like I am, you wake up and you can't tell which way's up until you get that cup of coffee, right? And God forbid, trying to speak before you've had it, because that's even crazier. But Ilyin is saying, when you decide to do your kanona, do your morning prayers first, to spend your time thanking God for the day that he's given you, for the life that he's given you, and asking him to help you repent of the sins that you've committed since you woke up, and even if you committed any sins while you slept, which I know is a controversial thing if you're a Protestant, but the Orthodox, that makes a little bit more sense. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime. When you make that choice, you are committing an act of violence against yourself, right? You're committing an act of violence against your passions. You're waking up going to war. You're
slaughtering your sins.
Yes. You're waking up going to war. And when someone doesn't do that and then decides, okay, well, it's actually okay if I have my cup of coffee first, that is them failing to commit violence against themselves. And then they say, okay, well, I've had my coffee, I may as well screw around on my phone for a little bit, or run a couple of errands.
Are you talking about me?
I'm talking about me. Or I'm going to go run a couple of errands before I do my prayers, or this or this. And eventually you get to the end of the day and you haven't done your prayers.
Yeah.
That's
another act of violence.
That's someone who, that's an act of violence against if you're a baptized Christian, against the Holy Spirit within you.
Yeah.
Right?
You're lying to yourself too.
Right. Which, as Solzhenitsyn's discussed, is not good. But when someone surrenders to their passions on a regular basis for long enough, eventually they begin to fall into greater and greater sins, right? So an act of violence would be when I go to confession and say to my spiritual father,
these are the things
that I've done, right? I am opening myself up to an act of violence from my spiritual father to stand beside me in confession and wage war against my passions with me.
Yeah, he's fighting those demons with you.
Right, but whenever I reject that, I allow those passions to come in on the other side. And eventually that can lead to someone like Ted Bundy, right? And I'm not saying that if you don't do your prayers in the morning before you have a cup of coffee, you're going to be a mass murderer. But
there's a chance.
Well, the more you excise God from your life, the more you become a foot soldier of demons.
Yeah.
Right?
So would you say, to touch on that, would you say this has to do with how humanism cannot confront evil in one's soul?
Well, humanism can't confront evil in one's soul because humanism is in many ways fundamentally materialistic. I mean, I don't think, to give an example, that Petrarch or even William of Ockham, who's kind of the first humanist in many ways, I don't think either of them believed in strict materialism in the way that we encounter that today, but they did open the door for that. And man,
I was, yeah, and also I think humanism, it can't confront the need for divine grace to elevate and redeem humanity.
Right. Well, humanism, in many ways, so we had a discussion the other day about I believe it was Francis Bacon, who posited that...
I want to make so many jokes about that last name.
Bacon. I don't know, it was either Francis or Roger Bacon, I don't remember which one.
He was a Bacon.
The earlier one. Oh my goodness, you're killing me. Well, he was certainly not halal. That was pretty low-hanging fruit. I'm sorry that everyone had to hear that. One of them posited that the reason that diseases and physical misfortunes exist are because demons have a greater knowledge, a near perfect knowledge of the material world and how it works. And so we need to practice the natural sciences to learn how to combat that. Now, I don't think that assessment is necessarily wrong.
Because God also does allow these things.
Right. Well, the assessment of, that's why the things can happen isn't necessarily wrong.
No.
However, when, as we discussed last time, you begin to remove theology from that, when theology ceases to inform that, when you take the demons out, then you end up in a world that has nothing to say about the spiritual illness of men. And that's one of the things that Solzhenitsyn also says, is that where does he say that? In humanism, we have allowed science to move past its proper place. So at the end of the...
science is our new God.
Yeah, science...
Well, not ours, but, society.
Science has decided that it can tell us not why things happen, or not how things happen, but why things happen. So the example that can be given here is, and Ian, you need to play along with it this time.
Okay.
Is Ian walks into a kitchen, and he walks into my kitchen, and he sees a teapot with boiling water in it. Why is the water boiling?
Because you're cooking something.
Now you're not playing along. No, so the standard scientific answer would be because water boils at
a certain temperature,
depending on your altitude.
Cool.
Right?
Why? But that's not.
But
that's how.
But the actual answer is no. The water's boiling because I want a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Science can only answer the how, and when we take the demons out, or when we take God out, science begins to answer why. Or something has to answer the why, and in this case, in the materialistic case, it's become science.
Yeah, science and technology.
And that doesn't work. I mean, I know we hadn't planned on going this far, but I'm going to make an observation that might make some people uncomfortable.
Here we go.
It makes, to anyone who's ever studied epidemiology and the way biology functions, it makes no freaking sense that, shall we say, promiscuous behavior leads to disease. there are X number of epithelial organisms that live on particular portions of an individual's body, both male and female, and that's, there's some variation depending on the person.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make sense that 15 different interactions between 15 different people, all mixed up in a bag and thrown out into the world, create syphilis. That does not make sense. Right?
Yeah.
And science has come to this point where...
We see that with what we're going through right now.
Right. Well, science is like, oh, well, it just happens. It's like, well, obviously it happens. Like, we see it. Obviously it's happening. But I want to know why it's happening. And I honestly think that what we might classify as the typical medieval answer would be, it happens because God said, don't behave in this fashion, and people did.
Exactly.
And so God allowed these diseases to come about as a judgment.
Which is what we're seeing right now with the whole COVID, pandemic, if that's what you want to call it. But there's been priests that have spoke on, why are we in this situation? And it's because of our sins.
Right.
Our continual, meddling, not being self-reflective, not repenting for our sins, lying to ourselves. And, like we talked about earlier, even the intellectual and the elite lying to us, which causes a ripple effect. And we see our whole society.
Well, especially when we begin to believe that.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we see the idolization of the lie is this whole idea that the university is a prerequisite to joining adult life.
Yeah, now you're a member of society.
Right, which is ridiculous because as someone who took 8 years to get my undergrad because I despise many things about the university system, like, it is a bloody joke.
Yeah.
But shifting gears a little bit, one of the other things that Solzhenitsyn talks about is this whole idea that we've begun to treat politicians and the political view as though, in many ways, it can save us, right? And this is definitely a very humanistic thing. But before we get...
Hashtag not my president.
Wow. So before we get into that too much, though, Ian had mentioned that he wants to talk about QAnon a little bit. Now, I'll say that I know next to nothing about QAnon, other than it's got some rather odd beliefs, as one might guess from such an interesting acronym. But what on earth is QAnon, and why does it relate to Solzhenitsyn?
Okay, well, he talks about how we've become a society that has put all of its trust in man and in itself, right? So, and I was a victim of this, and although I'm grateful for the things that I learned or that maybe I already knew, but I just need a little bit of refreshment, the QAnon movement is basically, a psyop within a psyop. So you're being fed all this information, and that's something we're going to touch on, your right to know everything. So the QAnon movement was this far-right fringe group that thought they knew everything about the political elite and all this stuff, and they believed that, Trump was their savior. So politics became salvific, and I was, part of this movement and guilty of it as well. But what I started to realize, and, glory to God for this, is I started to see the deception within it. So like I said, it was like a psyop within a psyop. You were stuck in this echo chamber, and all that mattered was, Trump was our savior. Some people were even going as far to actually, believe that. And I'm lucky that I started to see through it, and I found orthodoxy, at just the right time.
Well, and I've definitely got some friends that still believe that Trump is somehow going to regain the White House, and so this is going to maybe touch on something that's a little bit unpopular.
Dude, he won.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different question entirely.
I know.
But here is so we've built this podcast series thus far as what's wrong with the world. Specifically in America, this is one of the things that is wrong with the world. America is so firmly within the grasp of a heresy called Chiliasm. And it's on the left and the right. And it's one of the things that, much like coming into Orthodoxy did for you, coming into Orthodoxy did for me.
Yeah.
Was made me realize, like, wait a minute. The left
And the right.
and the right both do this. They do it in different ways,
Yeah.
but they both do
There's
this.
only one side. That's the narrow path with Christ.
Right. So for anyone who doesn't know, Chiliasm is the idea that was enshrined in modern American pop culture, at least for a brief time. It was mercifully short, thank God. But it's the idea that the 1,000-year reign of Christ mentioned in the Apocalypse of St. John, for those who aren't Orthodox, Revelation, refers to a time when Christ will physically return, reign for 1,000 years. Then there's going to be another round of demonic civil war of demonic rebellion against Christ, right? And that was best described, I think, in the modern mind in the way that Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins did with the Left Behind series.
Yeah.
Right? Which that is
another podcast.
Oh my gosh, that's
maybe
like
not
10
even worth
podcasts. Not worth it. But that is how that's
all the
been enshrined.
prophetic.
And the idea is that Christ's return heralds a materialistic paradise, right? He's coming down to earth. Jerusalem is coming down to earth, and we're going to reign with Christ for 1,000 years on the earth as it is. Not that he's going to renew creation, but that we're going to fix everything and reign in a paradise.
Doesn't sound right.
And the left seeks to do that through what Jonathan Pajot might call,
Weaponized compassion.
Weaponized compassion. If we can
Yeah.
only be nice enough
Judas
to
Iscariot.
people, if we can only be nice enough to people, then we'll have paradise. And the right says, well, no, if we only allow for legitimate autonomy and freedom and people can do whatever they want, then we'll begin to achieve this kind of paradise.
Sounds a bit
on
like
the earth.
being a libertarian.
Well, libertarianism is...
Satanism.
Yeah. Although I'm not accusing libertarians of being Satanists.
No,
I have
no.
a lot of friends who have libertarian political leanings.
But it's definitely a doorway, or a lot of people seem to...
It is not a good place to be.
Yeah.
So
yeah, with QAnon, it was, the right to know external info as opposed to knowledge of oneself again.
Right.
So, people became completely obsessed with all this information. And I think Solzhenitsyn has a quote about it, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but he mentions, basically being fed all this gossip, all the time, and all this, having our divine soul stuffed with gossip, nonsense, and vain talk, it's not good for the soul. And that's what I started to realize is I don't have a problem burning bridges if it's, if it's meant to be, but I definitely think there was some bridges burned that didn't need to be, just because I was so fixated on, the Trump phenomena and the QAnon movement. And I was so obsessed with this gossip and nonsense and vain talk, and not putting my energy into Christ, or to being more Christ-like,
Right.
So,
well,
and I'm glad that now, looking back, I can realize I learned a lot. I learned a lot about society. I learned a lot about, the elite and things that I already knew. And we talked about this. It's not like we needed QAnon to tell us that the elite are, PEDOs and stuff like that.
Well, and I'm not even going to say the elite, generally speaking. I'm going to say we didn't need QAnon to tell us that our society is morally bankrupt.
Yeah, look around.
If you needed QAnon to tell you that, you either live in Alaska and the nearest person to you is like 600 miles away, or you are so distracted by irrelevant things that you don't care.
And that's what I realized, like I said, I filled my soul with gossip and nonsense, rather than,
Right.
stuff that now I find a lot more important and salvific and edifying to my soul.
Well, and this touches on something, especially with Solzhenitsyn's view of the press as well, but one of the great lies that was told in the internet at the dawn of the age of the internet, and you and I are both old enough to remember when this was actually something that people were saying.
You are.
I'm not sure what the insinuation is here.
Well, people can't see you, so they won't understand either.
Wow. So when the internet was coming into vogue, and when, especially, and this was even more prevalent when cell phones that had internet capability were becoming a thing.
Ah, the good old razors.
I actually loved the razors. I had one for a long, long time.
#, bring back the razor.
Well, they're trying to, and I'm really not sure how I feel about that now that they're doing it.
And that's another episode.
It's a monster. One of the things that was said was you will have all of the knowledge of human experience throughout time at your fingertips. And what do? We fall back to the ancient Egyptians. Everybody worships cats and writes on walls. Was the joke that was put out there when Facebook, which, as I'm now told, is something that old people use, when Facebook walls were a thing that people referenced.
I wonder why someone told you that.
Well, I wouldn't know. I'm young and spry. And so Solzhenitsyn's criticism of this proceeds thusly. We may witness shameless intrusion into the privacy of well-known people according to the slogan, everyone is entitled to know everything. But this is a false slogan of a false era. Far greater in value is the forfeited right of people not to know, not to have their divine souls stuffed with gossip, nonsense, vain talk. A person who works and leads a meaningful life has no need for this excessive and burdensome flow of information. Hastiness and superficiality, these are the psychic diseases of the 20th century. And more than anywhere else, this is manifested in the press. In-depth analysis of a problem is anathema to the press. It is contrary to its nature. The press merely picks out sensational formulas.
Yeah, like the tabloids. We talked about tabloids.
Right. Now, I will say that our criticism that we're putting forward in this episode is not aimed squarely at the press, although the press does deserve, the media does deserve this. Solzhenitsyn is writing this in an era when newspapers, television, and radio have a monopoly, and book publishing to some extent, have a monopoly on information.
Yeah.
Nowadays, there are half a dozen, if not more, in America, half a dozen,
Alternative.
if not more, alternative blog sites where you can publish whatever you want.
And I mean, we're kind of on the borders of that, so.
Right, and the same with podcasts, which is what Ian and I are doing. So people now have the ability to let everyone know everything. I occasionally publish articles to Medium, and under a pseudonym, so very few people actually know who I am and how to find me, which is a slight mercy, I think. But because of that, I get emails from Medium occasionally that say, it'll be like, okay, here's the top 15 stories or the top 25 or 50 stories today. And so every now and then when I'm in a less discerning mood, which happens more regularly than I'd care to admit, I'll click on that email just to see what's in there. Maybe there'll be something that interests me, right? Usually not usually. That has unequivocally been the case, that there's nothing interesting in there, but sometimes I'm dumb enough to try twice. And so one time I opened that email, and the first blog post that they said, hey, this is popular today, people ought to check this out, was nothing but a compilation of quotes that some woman had put together of the top 75 weirdest things she's ever heard after a one-night stand.
Can you send me that link?
No. That's what Solzhenitsyn is talking about. That is not just moral superfluous, or that is not just a superfluous statement. That is a morally depraved and atrocious thing that ought not sully anyone's soul.
It's a psychic disease.
Yeah. No one needs to see that. I mean, no one needs to know that this woman had 75 one-night stands.
But could you still send me the link?
No.
Okay.
I don't know where it is. Honestly, I don't remember what it was called, and I wish to God I'd never seen that title, because that was just what the heck?
But
why would
people
anyone
choose
publish
to
that?
fill their souls with this. Like you said, you were stupid enough to click it, but there's some people who don't even look at it as being stupid. It's just a daily thing where they're going through the top 50 news stories, and they come out of it probably more depressed, or they end up on this path of passions that they didn't need to be on.
Right.
You read an article like that, and then the next thing you know, you're watching porn.
Well, I mean, that's how it goes for a lot of people. I mean, I remember, oh man, it's interesting how demons draw us into sin, or how they at least present sin to us. We've already discussed the comparison that Saint Paisios made. Your mind is like an airport, and demons are, and just thoughts in general, but demons specifically are like aircraft requesting permission to land at the airport.
Yeah.
It is crazy how demons convince you to let them land. And I mean, I'm not saying that when we do that, we don't have a significant degree of culpability, because we could have resisted.
Yeah.
But, anything can be a trigger for porn, or for, swearing or whatever. I know later on at some point in the next couple of days, we're going to do a reaction podcast or video to a James White interview, and James White is a man, as you well know, for whom I have little fondness.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to download the widget that lets me bleep.
Yeah,
we need to pray about it for a few days.
No, we've been praying about it. I think it'll be okay. But I mean, I say that to give the example that, the road to sin is very, very, very short.
Yeah.
And it's easy to fall down. And
easy.
Solzhenitsyn's noting that. Like, you don't have the right to know everything. You have a right to not know things. Like,
yeah.
I would very much like to not know that, to use the example we've been beating to death already, that, that this particular woman had 75 one-night stands, and all of them had weird comments made during them. I'm like, well, I don't know what kind of normalcy you were expecting in this interaction, but,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But, I didn't need to know that. I didn't want to know that. And, like, this, as Ian and I kind of mentioned, this brings up the whole idea of paparazzis and tabloids. Like, another unpopular take that I put forward sometimes is, I am not a proponent of free speech. Not in the way that it's practiced in America right now. And for starters, I think...
As a blanket statement, that sounds wrong.
It's very nuanced, and it's more... It's less sketchy than it sounds.
Yeah.
But it still sounds sketchy. There's no way around that. But
well, this is good. We're kind of moving into where we wanted to go.
Right. I think tabloids, for starters, ought to be illegal. That is nothing but... Those tabloids are nothing but volumes of lies that are known to be lies. And you cannot take that in and not have that shift your entire noetic being, right? That is going to begin to poison you.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous. Like, the lies can be published about it. It's not even they're about made up people or made up stories or fairy tales or whatever. They'll pick someone, Britney Spears or whoever. That's the only popular person that I know anymore.
And like I said, you're old.
I dated myself. Like, the fact that someone can make up lies about Britney Spears, and that is okay to do, is beyond the pale to me. I don't understand why that's a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. The public's right to know, it's more so we have a fundamental right not to know.
Right. Well, as he says, not to have our divine souls sullied. But that does lead us to another issue, and that is, like, what is the purpose of all this external input? Like, if we don't have the external input, what ought we to be doing? And what does it distract us from?
God.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that's the main thing, but it also distracts us from building meaningful relationships and community, because we see, technology is advancing in a way where it's just completely separating people from each other. You have a community that's online. It's like, I have... I think Father Josiah Turnham had a little episode about the metaverse, and he said, I think he said his friend's son said, look, I have 400 friends. He goes, and he laughed.
Yeah.
And that's, we have this podcast, and I have the Orthodox Logos as well, and I'm trying to remember that this is not for me.
Right.
This is not to boost my ego or to do anything like that, but we see technology moving in a way that it's only about... It's so self-centered.
Well, one of the examples, I think, getting to what you were talking about with the idea of this myth of friendship online, for the most part, was in... I think it was January 2021 that this podcast was released. But Jonathan Pajot did an interview with Jordan Peterson, and it was one of the earlier interviews Peterson did after he had come back from his illness and his, when his health was finally beginning to recover enough for him to enter public life again. And, for anyone who's never listened to that interview, do it. I mean, it's honestly one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever heard, because, well, for a number of reasons, but maybe we'll get into that later.
The one when he cries?
Oh, dude, I cried when I listened to that podcast.
Yeah, same.
It breaks my heart to hear that.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing that Pajot said in that, because Jordan Peterson's talking about, I've got all these interactions and these these followers on social media and yada, yada, yada. And Jonathan Pajot goes, Jordan, I just want you to remember, man, online is not real. Those people like you, they respect what you have to say, but they're not your friends. They're not your family. But he tempered that by saying, also just know that there are a lot of people the world over who are praying for you. He goes, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, they're all praying for you. So take some solace in that, even though they're not your friends in the way that, Jordan and Jonathan are friends. They are still reaching out in that way, which is good.
Yeah, it's good it is, I'm not saying it's bad to have an online community.
But they're not your friends.
Yeah, but we make it a point to go out, numerous times a week to talk, and, we have a few beers and we enjoy our tobacco pipes. But how many people just sit at home and, these are my friends. This is my best friend. And I mean, I have a best friend who I talk to online mostly, but he's still my friend in real life. It's just, we live apart from each other, but there's people who are just,
Well, I mean, we want to talk about how technology is an idol at some point. Here's maybe here's an interesting way into it. Think of online dating.
Yeah.
Online dating, to an extent, makes sense if you're under the impression that the old style of, it's almost like a new version on arranged marriages. Especially if you're talking, long distance, like Flagstaff to Moscow or something like that. That makes some sense. But
people use it because they feel like they've run out of options.
Well, but doing something like Tinder, or did you know Facebook now has a dating app built into Facebook?
I did not, but I know you use Facebook, so.
Oh. Again, I'm not entirely sure what you're trying to insinuate here, given the context of what I just said, but nevertheless. But yeah, you're using something like Tinder or whatever the Facebook dating app is called, or whatever these other apps are called. I know there's too freaking many of them at this point.
How about you just go to church?
Well, not even a matter of that.
And meet a woman.
Go have coffee and talk to people.
Yeah.
The whole thing is,
without the goal of even potentially meeting someone.
Not even that. The whole thing is idolizing the self.
Yeah.
You use a dating app for people that are 2 miles away because you are too bloody lazy.
And guess
to
what?
Get up
You
off
use
your butt
the
and go
best
do
picture
something.
of yourself. You describe yourself in the best way possible, and then they meet you, and you don't look like that, and you don't do any of the things you said you do.
Right. Well,
it's another lie.
Right.
So he talks about live not by lies. Well, the technological age has just created a massive lie.
Well, yeah. Well, it's you wanted to talk about the metaverse, so we can definitely do that as well at this point too. But it is creating a. I don't want to say a lie or a falsehood because that's not entirely true. It's creating a parallel world where man as the creator is God.
Yeah.
Think about this.
We see this with AI.
Mark Zuckerberg creating the metaverse, or whatever the heck he's calling it, is the god of that universe.
Yeah.
Because he decides if you get to, and not him, he's not sitting there. Hopefully, I mean, if this is the case, this is even scarier. But hopefully, he's not sitting there going, "Yeah, no, you can be on here. No, you can't be on here. Yeah, you can. Well, you can, but I'm going to take some of these privileges away." But yeah, that's the whole fact checker phenomenon, right? Is the fact checkers are the ruling spirits of the Facebook universe, or the whatever media site.
I wanted to say something, but I didn't know if it would come off wrong about how it's they're the officers in the Gulag.
Yeah.
The metaverse is I don't know if this even makes sense, but a utopian Gulag.
Right. Where this becomes a problem, and to our listeners, I'm sorry if we're rambling too much, but where this becomes a problem, it's not that mankind is creating something. It's that we're made to
co-create, right?
Right. We're made to subcreate.
Yeah.
But part of the problem is we're doing these things to escape. We're doing these things to create a paradise. It comes back to Gulags, right? The Soviet Union happened because man thought man could create a paradise, and it turned into one of the greatest hells on earth.
We're not making these technological advances to bring society closer to God or to the truth.
Right.
We're pushing the complete opposite.
Right. We're using this as a distraction. I mean, I've got a long-standing argument with one of the guys that I converted with, that the world is heading not in the direction of 1984, but of Brave New World.
Yeah.
And I mean, to an extent, we've both been proven right at this point. But the reason that I argued for Brave New World and not 1984 is because one of the things that Huxley says, it's Orwell says, is it's just one long video, or it's one long video feed of a human face being crushed by a jackboot, right? And he's like, yeah, that's what totalitarianism is. And I think Huxley actually put it better, although he doesn't have any catchphrase like that, but he effectively shows a world where mankind goes to hell because its build is pleasurable. And there's that great discussion between this John the Savage and Mustafa Mond, the world controller.
Yeah.
Who, and John the Savage is saying, I want life to be hard. I want to live a Christian life. Now, his view of what that is very flawed, because what Huxley has created as Christianity is not what we would recognize as Christian. But he's like, I want to live a hard life. I want to live a real life. And Mustafa Mond says, okay, go ahead. No one's going to care. Like, no one wants that. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. We're seeing, like, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but we're seeing a total emancipation from the moral heritage of the West as well.
Yeah. Well,
and the lack of real struggle. I'm not saying people don't struggle, but we're creating struggle.
That's where cowardice is the greatest vice, and the death of courage in the West comes in, tying it back into Solzhenitsyn earlier. Like,
yeah.
How did you just phrase it? I'm sorry, my
total emancipation from the moral heritage of the West and from Christ.
Right, and that's due to cowardice. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, man.
Because the moral heritage of the West may not be the best way to put it.
Well, I'm okay with calling it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to embrace moral certitude, or not even moral certitude, to embrace a moral and virtuous life is the bloody hardest thing you'll ever do. Right? And I'm not saying that as opposed to living a Christian life or anything like that. I'm saying, like, the Christian life requires allegiance to virtue beyond what most of it, or beyond any of us are capable of doing.
In general, being virtuous and courageous.
Right. But that's so hard to do. That I know we haven't really talked about film at all, but one of the movies I think people ought to watch is called Gettysburg. And there's a great speech that happens in the midst of that. One of these guys who's been a spy for the Confederate Army, for James Longstreet specifically, he's come back to General Longstreet. He's given his report, and this is on the last day of the battle at Gettysburg. And it's right before the famed Pickett's Charge, for anyone who's familiar with Civil War history. And this guy comes up to Longstreet and says, "Okay, here's what's going on. Is there any way you can get me a musket? I want to be in this advance." He's like, "I haven't got to fight in the war, and I don't think I can look like I can't look my comrades in the army in the eye because I haven't fought." And
he hasn't been courageous.
He hasn't been in the front lines. Well, he's been very courageous. He's been a spy. Like, if he gets caught, he's dead.
He's dead, yeah.
That's a guaranteed dead right there. But he hasn't been able to fight on the field of war, and not in the way that he wants to, at least. And Longstreet gives this 5-minute speech saying, "This advance is doomed. These men are going to get blown apart. If anyone comes back from this, it's going to be a miracle of God." And you're listening to it, and it's like, I listen to that, and I like to think that I'm not quite a coward, but I'm listening to that, and I'm like, screw that.
I'm
not going to do that. I don't want a musket. Screw this. And Longstreet gets to the end of his speech, and the actor goes, or the spy goes, "If you don't mind, sir, I'll go find that musket now." And he goes to war. And we don't have that attitude in the West anymore.
No.
It's gone.
Yeah. Someone in the comments, John MC, said, "If you want a vision of the future, it is a jackboot stomping on a human face forever."
That's the quote from 1984.
So, yeah.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. I knew I screwed it up somehow.
But yeah, we're seeing, the lies in the modern West were afflicted by civil war, culture war, and, it's a question of, are our liberties under God and the law, or is the proper spiritual and intellectual foundation of free government autonomy? And I know that's something we're going to speak on as well.
Well, how much longer do you want to go? Do we want to keep on going with this, or?
I think maybe we could take a quick break.
Okay. So we'll pop on some music real fast, and we'll jump back on, guys. Apologies for the long discussion thus far.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions or comments or concerns, let us know. We appreciate you being here. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll be back briefly. God bless.
endureth
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 3 of The Road to Paradise. We took a short break for a second, but we're going to go ahead and get right back into things. And today we're discussing Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Harvard commencement speech. We've touched on a lot of different topics. The last thing we spoke about was technology as an idol, and I had a question for Nathan before we took a break, and that question was, are liberties under God and the law, or is the proper spiritual and intellectual foundation of free government autonomy?
So my answer to that is, I very much want to go down some ridiculous rabbit hole and say either yes or no and just leave it at that. But I'm actually going to read a semi-related quote from Solzhenitsyn again, and he says this: "A fact which cannot be disputed is the weakening of human personality in the West, while in the East it has become firmer and stronger. 6 decades for our people and 3 decades for the people of Eastern Europe. During that time we have been through a spiritual training far in advance of Western experience. The complex and deadly crush of life has produced stronger, deeper, and more interesting personalities than those generated by standardized Western well-being. Therefore, if our society were to be transformed into yours, it would mean an improvement in certain aspects, but also a change for the worse on some particularly significant points. Of course, a society cannot remain in an abyss of lawlessness, as is the case in our country. But it is also demeaning for it to stay on such a soulless and smooth plane of legalism, as is the case in yours. After the suffering of decades of violence and oppression, the human soul longs for things higher, warmer, and purer than those offered by today's mass living habits, introduced as by a calling card by the revolting invasion of commercial advertising, by TV stupor, and by intolerable music."
So this kind of goes into the value of the rule of law within a decent society.
Yes, but the most interesting part of, well, I won't say the most interesting part, but the most relevant bit to your question is his criticism of legalism.
Okay.
Law, much like science, does not stand alone, right? I mean, even as much as I have disdain for the American model of government, even the American model recognized this for a long time, right? And that is what we see in the preamble to our Declaration of or not the preamble. That's what we see in the Declaration of Independence, right? Laws come from God. They come from the Creator. The problem is, of course, they're referring to a deist God.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, but they come from God. The law is just the expression of God's will, right?
Yeah,
But
there's a hierarchy.
right. But now in America, we've come to this point where we have modern political actors in America
Pundits.
well, not even pundits, but political actors saying things like, "It's ridiculous that the majority can't rule," and it's like, has human history taught you nothing? The least suited group of people to rule are the majority.
Yeah.
So, no, laws are the law as its own thing, as a standalone judge, is not the source of human society and flourishing.
Yeah, that's why he says the Western way of life is less and less likely to become the leading model.
Well, it ceased to be the leading model.
On a lot of different aspects.
I would say it ceased to be the leading model pretty close to it beginning, because I mean to be fair, in American history there were a lot of interesting and morally sketchy and atrocious things that occurred. But the fact that the will of the people is in any way enacted in an autonomous fashion in the U.S. is a problem.
Yeah.
So,
and someone in the chat, one of the moderators, David, he says, it seems that Orwell only saw the future of human oppression, but not the possibility of ultimate salvation in Christ.
Right. Well, I mean, Orwell, as John noted, Orwell was an atheist.
Yeah.
And he was very much a socialist.
Yeah.
But
a good point by our listeners, definitely. He saw things coming, but he didn't see, the end goal, so to speak.
Right.
Or, ultimate salvation.
But briefly touching on government for a moment, one of Solzhenitsyn's most aggressive criticisms of the U.S. was this idea of autonomy and liberty and freedom.
Yeah.
Right. libertinism is necessarily bad. And one of the ways that he touches on this is he criticizes a fellow named George Kennan, and I'm not entirely sure who he was, although I presume he was probably someone in the executive branch in the 70s. But Kennan basically said something to the effect of, we can't apply moral standards to the law. And that is still a very popular refrain today. You'll hear people say, don't legislate your morality. And I'm like, okay,
How do you
what would
separate
you
the-
like me to legislate?
Yeah, how do you separate the two?
You can't.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's got the moral standard that they appeal to. And the only moral standard we have today is individual happiness. But not in the, to give, again, credit where credit's due to the founders of the U.S., they wanted, and you see this especially reflected in Ben Franklin and John Adams, they wanted freedom for the pursuit of virtue, not vice. That's why things like blasphemy were still illegal in the U.S. for a very long time, and in some places still technically are. Those laws are still in the books, but they wanted people to pursue virtue.
Yeah.
And when you remove the moral standard from law, you can't do that. So the way that happens, and here's where we're going to start touching on some more modern political commentaries. I presume many of you are familiar with what's been happening in Canada lately. Canada has definitely gone straight through the looking glass with no regard for what that's going to lead to here in the near future, which is sad. But the recent legislation preventing quote-unquote conversion therapy from the Rainbow for members of the Rainbow Mafia is an example of what happens when happiness becomes the arbiter of what morality ought to be.
Yeah.
And it's not even happiness in the long term; it's happiness in the moment.
It's an endless self radicalization of modernity.
Right. Well, it's
It's just
one of the things that you see with drug addiction, right? And this is something you can give a better commentary on than I can, but you can't.
Is this you calling me an ex-drug addict because I called you old?
I wasn't being vindictive, but yeah. One of the things that you see with drug abuse is you can't. You have however much cocaine or whatever substance you're going to partake in, you have a small amount the first time you get high.
Yeah.
You can never have just that amount again.
Yeah, you're always chasing the dragon, so to speak.
Right. You have to keep, to kind of give a perverse take on C.S. Lewis's further up and further in comment. You have to keep going further up and further in.
Yeah.
And that is the road to self-destruction in this particular instance. And that's why we've moved from, sexually libertine behavior in the 60s to castrating little boys, either chemically or physically.
We've gone from free love to
you can choose your own identity
at 6 years old or whatever, the
right.
earliest they're doing now.
And now we're seeing, the early attempts at overt recognition of pedophilia, or as they, I suspect that we're going to see before we die, we're going to see the widespread occurrence of pederasty, and it's going to be referred to as pederasty, not pedophilia. And it's going to have lost its moral weight, which is going to be atrocious because, to kind of pick on myself for a moment now, I've heard people make the comments about like, oh yeah, well, that, kids want this or want that, so there's no reason why a 13-year-old shouldn't be able to sleep with a 50-year-old or whatever, right? I've got a background in medicine. I've taken care of the victims of that kind of thing. And I'll tell you what, one of the sins that
those kids did not want that.
It doesn't matter if they did.
Yeah.
Like, to say that those things make me feel murderous is not an understatement. That is a sin that I am working on. I ought not hate anyone that way. But seeing that happen, if that does not fill you with a sense of outrage, I don't know what to say.
As General Palpatine would say, let the hate flow through you.
Oh, making a Star Wars reference. Yeah, sure.
No, but yeah.
Well, no, don't let the hate flow through you. Like, that's not good. Hating someone for that is bad. So, like, earlier I just called the members of the, if you want to say their name, because I'm not going to, if you feel like you're
the
more
LGBTQ community, also known as
the Rainbow Mafia.
Or the Alphabet
Soup Mob.
Yes.
Like, I will, like, one ought not hate them. I pity them. I feel a tremendous amount of pity, especially
because we're all dealing with our own sins and our own, self-deception and lying to ourselves.
right.
But theirs has become such a grand.
Well, the people that I'm angry, so like I said, I'm not angry at the people to whom this is being done, right? I'm outraged at the people though who are acting as, what's the modern phrase these days, influencers.
Yeah.
That are pushing that.
Those the people on TikTok who are pushing, you have 10-year-old gay boys on Instagram or TikTok,
right? Because
they got this idea somehow that, well, it's okay.
I wonder how they could have possibly run across those ideas. Yeah. But yeah, that is an outrageous turn of events, and that is what happens when we have this fall into happiness as the ultimate moral good.
Well, if it makes me happy to be with the little boy, then that's okay, right?
I mean, probably isn't making the little boy terribly happy. Would
exactly,
be my assessment.
But that's what they're thinking. This makes me happy.
And to go further, even if it did, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Like,
and that's what we go back to, like the free speech thing, for a second.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if writing slanderous lies makes you happy.
Yeah,
or doesn't mean you can, or makes the readers happy.
And I've said this before at our local bookstore, which unfortunately is our only bookstore, and we pretty much try to buy them out of everything, but they have like a drag queen story time,
right?
And this was, and I'm still still working on this, but when I saw it online, I had to comment on it, and basically said, this isn't right. This has nothing to do with what we need to be teaching kids. And I remember I even told you I sent an email asking, just as an example, if I was able to read, the Bible or the lives of the saints to the kids, and they said, unfortunately, we're not interested in that. And that just shows the decline in society, where it's like, okay, but you can have a drag queen reading these kids stories about God knows what, but I can't come in and it's funny because they talk about free speech there. They have like,
they've got their list of censored books,
that
but one of the things, interestingly, so what they'll do is they'll wrap books in like butcher paper.
Yeah, and caution tape or something.
Something like that. And they'll write on there, this book is banned in X, however many countries, whatever the book happens to be is banned in. And they'll say it's $7 or whatever. The one book they've never done that with is a Bible.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
People are being persecuted and killed for being Christians, but...
Well, being Christian is the most dangerous religious view you can hold in the world, period. I mean, lest we forget, when ISIS was at its apogee, they were crucifying Christians in the streets. That was a thing that happened.
Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago. I mean, if you've got the stomach for it, and I don't recommend doing this, but, before I was Orthodox, I saw some of these videos of ISIS executing Christians for being Christians.
Yeah, I've seen that stuff too. It's
like horrific. That was really, really recently.
That's also maybe another thing that shouldn't be shown. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, because see, that's what I mean when we talk about free speech or what should be shown. Right. It's like,
I don't think those things. I honestly don't know how I would phrase that.
Yeah.
I don't think. I think it's good that YouTube doesn't let videos like that be put up, I think.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
this is what it means to be a Christian for some people.
Well, the world needs wake-up calls, right? We live in a benighted age where we do not know what is real anymore. That was for anyone who's ever read the atheist Marxist Christian philosopher, what's his name, Slavoj Žižek. Definitely a hard guy to read, but he's interesting. I disagree with a lot of things that he says, but he's a very interesting author. But right after 9/11, one of the things that he wrote was, for you Americans, this 9/11, or for most of you Americans, 9/11 wasn't real. And what he meant by that was, for most of you, the events that occurred only make sense within the context of an action movie. So to most of you, it was just a really emotionally poignant showing of, I don't know, what's a movie that would be roughly equivalent to that? I can think of one.
Like Saw.
Well, I mean, not even like Saw, but something that just shows a national tragedy. So it'd be,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, it would be like a more emotionally poignant version of Die Hard.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty crass way to refer to it, but he's not wrong. Like, the reason that I say that, too, is because my views since then have changed, and that, like I've said, I spent a lot of time working in emergency medicine, and people, for the most part, have never actually witnessed death. Like, most people, the first time, the only time they ever see a dead body is either on TV, and that can be either fictional or real, or in a
but it's hard to have an emotional connection to it if it's
in a funeral home.
Yeah.
And it's
still
I'll tell you, watching those things versus actually being there when the person's alive to when they're not,
completely different,
is a very different experience. Watching, you imagine seeing someone, you imagine people in the Twin Towers or in the Pentagon or on Flight 93, and you imagine, oh man, they could have got burned alive. And that's a really horrible thing to think about. But I've seen the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
I know what that looks like. I know what that sounds like. I know what it smells like. And that is not a common experience for most Americans.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean,
it's a wake-up call.
Yeah. Yeah, to say the very least. This is actually a good tie-in to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is the whole idea of autonomy leading to fictional struggles. So one of the things that's very common to hear in the liberal West these days is, speech is violence, or conversely, silence is violence. And
which makes absolutely no sense.
It does if you have an orthodox view, but if you don't, and you're just thinking that violence is me punching you in the head or threatening to punch you in the head.
Well, I mean, silence is violence.
Well, I mean, again, it's actually technically correct, I think.
Not saying anything is an act of violence. We talked about that earlier about when
well, what Gillian was saying about violence.
Yeah, exactly.
Violence is not necessarily like
it doesn't have to be physical.
The final step of violence is physical, but violence starts in your head
with a thought.
Yeah, or lack thereof.
Yeah.
So one of the things that Solzhenitsyn observes, and I think you have this written down somewhere, is his whole idea of how homeostasis in a comfortable setting is not good. And that, I think, can kind of touch on why we're starting to see this move into unreality.
Yeah, he talks like dependency.
Yeah.
Yeah, he says the welfare state and our ever-increasing desire for material goods doesn't bode well for anybody. Solzhenitsyn noted. He made an analogy with the biological reality that a high degree of habitual well-being is not advantageous to a living organism. Our declining self-reliance, consumerism, and material cravings have eroded our capacity to develop and grow.
Right. And that's... Oh, man. That's such a good quote. The thing that the modern world needs to consider with regard to this is that we find enough difficulty in life when we live life.
Yeah, we don't mean
without making up.
Yeah, we don't need to make up extra struggles if we're just,
if the great, I mean, if we're going to be brutally honest here, if the greatest persecution that you ever face as a woman or a man is someone complimenting you at work, and when you didn't want the compliment,
you took it as sexual assault.
Right. Your life is pathetically easy.
Well, that's probably, and this, I hope this doesn't come off wrong, but it goes back to the people who probably just spend all their day on the metaverse, where everybody's same ideology, it's the same ideology.
That's not even the same ideology. When you spend a time...
You're separated from what real struggle is.
Well, not even you're separated from what real struggle is. That's definitely part of it, but you're separated from what is real.
Yeah.
Like, you're placing yourself in a story that is so fake, it doesn't even have the veneer of being real.
And then when you come out of the metaverse into the real world, you're still stuck in that same...
Well, you still think the same.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the same thing we talked about with tablets. What you fill your mind... The thing that fills your mind controls the way that you perceive the world.
You are what you eat?
That's very crass, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you eat, you know what, you become, you know what. Yeah.
This is why we can't have nice things, folks.
But yeah, so on the subject of autonomy, you know, we saw that with what, Chaz. Remember Chaz? I'm sure everybody remembers Chaz, and they tried to make it an autonomous zone, but what ended up happening is it just became pure chaos. I'm pretty sure a few people died because of they didn't want a government, but they then appointed someone to be in control.
Right.
And it was like completely backwards.
Well, I mean, that's definitely what you have to do.
It's a failure to acknowledge, and they had a failure to acknowledge intrinsic evil, you know. And I think Solzhenitsyn has that quote: "It's the drama of good and evil in the human soul," and that's where we got, you know, the title for our
right. Well, that's Solzhenitsyn's one of his critiques of humanism as well. Is humanism took the good things about man and blew them up to such an extent, or inflated them to such an extent, that it lost or ignored the capacity for evil in the human spirit. One of the so I want to shift this in a patristic direction. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to read something from Ivan Ilyin, and he.
Yeah, this was a wonderful excerpt from his book, and the name of the book is
name of the book is Foundations of Christian Culture, translated by Deacon Nicholas Kotar.
And we'll make sure to link all these books that we've referenced, and you know, all the links to the PDFs from Solzhenitsyn as well.
Right. And
but yeah, we talked about earlier how we kind of wanted we're getting close to the end of this podcast, and we talked about how we wanted to tie things back into, you know, a sense of hope, and
right.
you know, and reading from church fathers, and tying things back into that there is hope in Christ.
Right.
You know, minus all the things that we see going on, all the things that we talked about. This, you know, we're not here to make people depressed.
Speak for yourself. So in this book, The Foundations of Christian Culture, which was written in 1937, if my memory's correct, let me actually double check this since I have the book in my hand. Yes, 1937. He's discussing 4 different things that modern men seek. And the third one is, I think, the most interesting one, because it touches on this whole idea of capitalism versus communism, which to my mind is a false dichotomy. Those are just 2 disparate ends of materialism. So, I mean, materialism is in opposition to Christianity. So
yeah,
we'll go from there. But he says, modern man is governed by an instinct to obtain and consume. The laws of the market rule over him, and he has no power over these laws because he has lost the sense of the presence of the living God in his heart. We have reached an absolute dead end of capitalist production and have found only one way out of it: socialism and communism. We have not understood that it is not capitalism itself that is horrifying. It is a godless capitalist regime that is horrifying because it is upheld by people who have dead souls. But godless communism is endlessly more horrifying than godless capitalism. And so, having lost both God and Christ, the soul of modern man, religiously chaotic and morally degenerate as it is becoming, cannot help but become a victim of the instinct to buy and buy and buy some more. Ian, what do you make of that? I've got some thoughts, but what do you make of that?
Well, I feel like I want to hear what you have to think, and maybe I can piggyback off it because you're a little bit more familiar with that.
So, there's a really common Protestant phrase out there that says, man has a God-shaped hole in his heart. And if you don't fill it with God, you're going to try to fill it with other things. You know, you're going to fill it with sex or
drugs
or alcohol or goods or whatever thing you can happen to find.
Drag queen story hour.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, no, I mean that actually works out. Like, we receive everything through God. In him we live and move and have our being, right? To quote a Greek playwright that was later quoted by St. Paul. When we abandon that, we have to find our identity in something. And that can play itself out in drag queen story hours. It can play itself out in debauched sexual behavior. It can play itself out in...
Chaz.
Yeah, it can play itself out in, moving from revolution to revolution. to try to change things for the
From one
quote-unquote
social justice warrior cause to another.
right. And all that is the search for meaning. And if you don't bring God back into it, I mean, that's, people say, political commentators and actors often say, well, if we do this one thing, that'll fix this. And it's like, dude, our nation doesn't even have an identity anymore. I mean, in one of the brief live streams that I did, I discussed the problem of identity in America and how we don't have an identity. There is really no such thing.
To say you're American means what nowadays?
Well, to say you're an American means that you abide by a particular set of laws and a particular form of government, but that's not an identity.
Yeah, laws don't make your identity.
Right. So, we have no American mythology with which to base.
People identify with, I support Black Lives Matter, I support QAnon.
Right.
Politics become people's identities, or
Right.
their pronouns become their identities. And truthfully, we're made in the image of God, so the only thing that we should identify as being,
It's something that C.S. Lewis said a while back. Well, I say a while back. It's something that he observed. He said he's never met an ordinary human being. He's only ever met various people who are the image of God.
Yeah.
And
that's something that's hard sometimes to recognize when you see that drag queen reading Story Hour. You still have to recognize that person was made in the image of God, not the person that they have identified themselves as.
Well, the sadness there is in seeing someone who has mutilated themselves.
Yeah. And I even think about these things as far as like I'm covered in tattoos, and I don't necessarily regret any of them, but I have those thoughts sometimes where it's like I've completely defiled what God has given me. And and at the time I didn't think of it that way, and I try not to beat myself up over it, but I get those looks sometimes, especially in the Orthodox Church, from the traditionalist, which I agree with,
Right.
the way that they think and what they see, but this was part of my journey, and that's something I try to remember about people that have done things to themselves or identify certain ways, is that it's part of their journey, and hopefully they come home. And Abbot Trifon just released that video I played yesterday called Come Home.
Right.
And it's like, you are obviously searching in so many of the wrong places. Just come home. And it sounds easy, and it's not, but...
Well, it's the hardest thing to do. The first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbors ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And...
loving your neighbor is probably one of the hardest. I think that's why it's the first commandment, right?
Yeah, well, it's hard. So one of the other books that we've discussed and that I've posted on a little bit is The Ethics of Beauty by Dr. Timothy Petitis. Everyone needs to read that book. The way that he parses suffering and trauma and the way we need to interact with one another in light of what we've suffered, because let's be honest, everyone has suffered.
Yeah.
Not in the same way. Like,
our lives were, me and you, our lives were completely different.
Right.
But we've both suffered. Mine wasn't greater than yours.
Right. It's just different. But we need to bear each other's burdens, and my God, that's hard.
And look where it led us. It brought us home.
Right.
Hopefully it brings others home too.
Right. Well, one of my really good friends is, and him and I are friends because we both share a pretty similar work background. But he's a pretty out and out homosexual.
I was going to say Nate's a male stripper.
No, never could do that. I don't have enough rhythm. But
oh, that's why.
And it's also morally reprehensible. But
and that's why.
Yes. But him and I are really good friends, and one of the reasons we've been able to maintain that friendship, and why I would like to think God willing, he moves away from that lifestyle and comes into the church, is because, from the first minute we met, it was like, he knew that I disagreed with his lifestyle, and obviously I know he disagrees with mine, because that's the necessary outcome of that.
He probably more so disagrees with your ideology,
right? Not
as much your lifestyle, but yeah.
But that's still a pretty damning comment against myself.
Yeah.
But we've been able to be friends because I have never once looked him in the eye and said, "Dude, you're going to hell because you think this." or anything like that. I'm like, dude, I can't judge you on that. I am not. I have so many rocks in my own eyes right now. Like, yeah, what you're doing is wrong.
But what I've done today is wrong too.
But I've done wrong things as well. And if you ever want to talk about this kind of stuff, hit me up and know that I pray for you.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we say in the liturgy. We call out us being the chief of sinners.
Right.
No matter what else is going on in the world, there's murderers, rapists, child molesters, and I'm not.
You're picking the most heinous things as a contrast.
I know. But in retrospect, we are the worst of sinners.
Well, we're the worst of sinners because we made the choice to sin. We don't know what led those other people to do people to do the things they did.
Yeah.
But we sinned. And this is especially poignant for those of us in the Orthodox Church because Saint Theophan the Recluse has a quote where he says something to the effect, somebody approached him and said, "Oh, what do you think about the Catholics and the Baptists?" And he's not referring to Baptists necessarily. He's talking about Protestant missionaries in general.
Not like the Southern Baptists nowadays.
Right. Well, Baptist is just a catch-all term in that kind of literature for Protestants, because Protestant missionaries were very active in Russia.
Yeah.
And that's being Orthodox. That's a pretty offensive thing, but they're out there and they're talking and they're trying to draw people away from the Orthodox faith. And Saint Theophan says, don't worry about the schismatics and the atheists. He goes, they have a God who loves them very much and desires their salvation. You look to yourselves, because we do know what happens to those who have tasted the body of Christ and turned their backs on it. You look to yourself.
Yeah. Those who are within the church.
And leave.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways we need to be sure to think of this is, we are the chief of sinners.
And not in an egotistical way.
Right. Yeah, because that can definitely become I'm the
worst of the worst.
Such a bad sinner. I'm so much worse than you.
And I love what our spiritual father says, and I know a lot of priests and spiritual fathers would say the same thing, is once you're in that church together, whether or not you agree on certain things, it ultimately doesn't matter. There's people at our church, we may not agree with certain things they do, but we're not black, we're not white, we're not left, we're not right. We are the body of Christ.
Right.
We are the church of,
When we help each other when we see one another struggling with sin.
Oh, and then somebody in the chat said, some are charged with struggling to learn to love the tatted biker dude who showed up at their traditional church.
Yeah, I mean, that works, but he does have Pascha as the license plate on his motorcycle.
And then someone else said, America, a culturally enriched, diverse fruit cocktail.
That is the most charitable read on that I've ever heard.
Oh, I love
I've
that.
got words for what America is, but I wouldn't say that.
And then I'll read another one. David said, if children are sent to schools run by politicians, we should expect them to learn to think like politicians.
Right.
Yeah, and in the chat they were discussing some of the stuff about curriculum,
Right.
transvestite reading in libraries.
So David is in Canada. David, if you have any commentary you'd like to, or anything you'd like to type out regarding the current state of Canada's war on God.
Yeah, he said, here in Canada, a member was recently removed from a school board meeting for questioning the age appropriateness of a children's book discussing sexual attractions and preferences. Yeah.
Dude, you guys seriously have gone through the looking glass. What happened? You're supposed to be the people who are freaking out about not having a jelly donut to give someone.
Well, as South Park said, blame Canada.
Are we seriously quoting South Park?
No, I am.
Okay, fair enough. I honestly don't know that I have seen remotely enough South Park.
It was like a huge musical skit where all they kept saying was blame Canada over and over.
Wow.
All right, back to more pressing matters. And
so with regard to judging other people, so as we've said before, the answer to the question, what is wrong with the world, is easily summed up in G.K. Chesterton. And he says, me.
Yeah.
If I fixed myself, if I turned away from my sins and my passions, the world would be better.
And this goes back to, this kind of circles back to the beginning of our stream where we talked about people like to blame everybody else but themselves.
Right. Because looking at yourself is rough. But there's a book called The Monk of Mount Athos by now Saint Sophrony, who was the spiritual son of Saint Silouan the Athenite. And in this book, there's
one of my favorite saints.
He's a great saint. He says, we see in others that which our own spiritual experience has shown us about ourselves. Thus a man's attitude to his fellow is a sure sign of the degree of self-knowledge he has attained. And he follows that up with, whoever has experienced the deep and intense suffering of the human spirit when excluded from the light of true being, and, on the other hand, knows what it is to be in God, has no doubt that every human being is of a permanent eternal value, more precious than all the rest of the world. And that is a damning insight of both the left and the right here in the States. Because the left...
That's all they see.
...abandons the cause of individual men for the sake of the revolution. You know, you allow someone to suffer so that something greater can come from it. You don't try to help them. The other thing that you see on the right is, well, they can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, therefore they don't deserve help.
Yeah.
Right?
They don't see that we're children of God.
Right. Both of them deny that, because if you use another person to gain a goal that may be good, but if you torture or cause another person to suffer for that goal is necessarily evil, which is something else that St. Silouan said. He says, where did he say that?
And we'll make sure to link this book as well. It was one of the first books I read as a, I guess you would say, an inquirer before I became a catechumen. And it was, I almost took the name Silouan, but God had other plans for me.
Right. I've got the quote written down, so if you'll give me a moment, I will find it and see
No,
if
yeah.
I can read my own handwriting.
I just wanted to thank everybody who's tuned in thus far and all the comments. Make sure to give the video a thumbs up, and if you are here on YouTube, subscribe as well. This will be broken into a two-part series on Spotify. It will remain a one-part series here on YouTube, but I just want to thank everybody. We really appreciate all the support, and we hope you have enjoyed the stream so far.
So what he says is, the starets likewise held that the certain sign by which to recognize good from evil is not so much the end, which may appear to be holy and sublime, so much as the means selected to achieve that end. And that...
Okay, what do you pull from that?
Well, we've got to know ourselves.
Know thyself.
Yeah, we need to learn about ourselves, and we also need to recognize that any good that is dangled before you, if it smacks of evil, ought be designated as something that doesn't pass the sniff test.
Yeah. When we reach the toll houses.
Right. Well, I mean, it will be better to draw suffering in on yourself and on ourselves in order to prevent suffering to others than to make someone else suffer so I can get something that will be good.
Yeah.
You know, and that is part of what I think it means to pick up our crosses. I know we were going to end on, if you've got nothing else to say, I know we're going to end on a quote from the Philokalia.
Yeah, let's end on a quote from the Philokalia, however you choose to pronounce it. And this is a book that we would both recommend, but it's something that I got.
Read it with the discernment of your, with the
blessing.
Permission and blessing of your spiritual father.
Yeah, it's definitely not, a beginner book.
Right. So this particular text is from the first volume of the Philokalia, and it's from Saint Hesychios. One of the things that he's discussing, you know, we talked earlier about the road to sin starting with temptation, right? And we often look at that as temptation is not necessarily a sin, and that is true. When the thought is trying to gain your permission to enter your mind, that is not necessarily a sin. But the moment you allow it access, that is when you have begun to sin. So St. Hesychios says, the provocation comes first, then our coupling with it, or the mingling of our thoughts with those of the wicked demons. Third comes our assent to the provocation, with both sets of intermingling thoughts contriving how to commit the sin in practice. And fourth comes the concrete action, that is the sin itself. And he goes on to discuss how we must then train our intellects and our minds to be on guard against such things, to question each thought. But he then ends with a quote from Saint David, King David, where he says, Early in the morning I destroyed all the wicked of the earth, that I might cut off all evildoers from the city of the Lord. And then he also, which is Psalm 101, verse 8. And then he also says, quoting from Exodus 23:32, Moses was likewise referring to the act of assent to a provocation in his words, "You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods." Attentiveness is necessary. We reference many books that would be useful to read and fun to talk about, and that will have meaningful content on this podcast. But really, attentiveness is where we must start. Prayerfulness and attentiveness.
Yes.
When you wake up in the middle of the night, pray. When you get up before you get that first cup of coffee, pray. When you're exhausted and you want to go to bed, pray. You don't have to do super long prayers, but that is where attentiveness starts.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you have any closing thoughts for us, Ian? I'm sorry, I know I've spent a
No,
lot of time yakking today.
no, it's been great. I always appreciate your insight. Yeah, I agree with you. I think looking inward and focusing on prayer and, the lives of the saints is probably it's the most important thing we can do as Orthodox Christians, or, people that are inquiring into the faith. And I want to say I appreciate you doing this podcast with me. It's been, a lot for me to digest, but I've learned a lot and I appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody that's tuned in. We almost got through 2 hours with no distractions, but my dogs are becoming restless and my landlord has become my landlord again. So, but yeah, it's been great. So sorry for any background noise at the end of this. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting. If you guys want to support the channel, I dropped a link in there for the Streamlabs. And if you want to ask any questions, we can answer them on the next episode. Not sure exactly what we're going to do with that one, but we'll probably be figuring that out today. Anything else you want to end on, Nathan?
Just leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And if there's any topics you'd like to hear us cover or any corrections you'd like to offer, we'd love to hear it.
We may not listen to them. Just kidding. No, yeah, we appreciate anything. We're trying to learn how to do this the best possible way. So we appreciate your insights.
Awesome.
Well, God bless you guys. Yeah, God bless. May God be with you. And we will see you on the next episode.
Cheers.